You weren't supposed to see this. Not here, not live, not with every major network camera locked in and streaming to millions. But in a Capitol Hill hearing room, under the cold glare of studio-grade lights, the kind that make sweat beads betray their host, something irreversible happened. And the man at the center of it, Donald J. Trump, realized it too late. Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture for the cameras. She did something far more dangerous. She waited. She let him think the morning was safe. Let him settle into the warm lull of friendly questions, polite smiles, and predictable answers. And then she placed a stack of verified messages in front of him, in front of the nation, and in front of a truth he's been running from for years. The air shifted instantly. Journalists froze mid-keystroke. Cameramen adjusted their zooms, not wanting to miss a single twitch of his expression. At first, Trump's face was unreadable, a neutral mask honed over decades in boardrooms and rallies. But his right hand moved, slow and deliberate, toward the notes in front of him. Team, that's the tell. The lawyers at his side leaned in, whispering. He didn't look at them. He looked at her. She didn't waste words. Mr. President, she said, there's a matter of national concern here. One that touches not only your public duties, but your private conduct. She didn't waste words. The words hit like a cold slap. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Somewhere in the back, a chair scraped against the tile floor. And still she did not blink. You need to understand something about power. It rarely crumbles in a single strike. It erodes, first with a doubt, then with a crack. First with a doubt, then with a crack. And then, when the foundation is weakened, the hammer falls. Crockett was holding that hammer. She began with a file folder, messages time-stamped, geotagged, and verified by an independent expert. Messages tied not to policy memos or official briefings, but to a woman the American public had never been told about, and shouldn't have needed to know about, except for one problem. That woman's life and livelihood were directly tied to decisions made inside the Oval Office. Decisions funded by your tax dollars. And in that instant, every person watching knew this wasn't theater. This was an execution. Here's the part most people will miss when they watch the clip on their phones. They'll see the exchange, the sharp words, the damning papers, but they won't see the preparation. This wasn't an ambush. It was a long game, one Crockett had been playing for weeks before the cameras ever rolled. An hour earlier, the hearing room felt like a polite formality. The kind of space where policy is discussed but no history is made. Trump leaned back in his chair, at ease, trading small jokes with allies. He'd fielded friendly questions about infrastructure, farm subsidies, and defense spending without breaking a sweat. The air was casual. The tension non-existent. That was intentional. Crockett was letting him breathe, letting him believe today was just another day he could glide through untouched. What he didn't know was that she had been tracing his public statements, his travel records, and his private schedules for months. She wasn't looking for gossip. She was looking for patterns. And in those patterns, she found something that didn't fit. A hotel check-in that didn't align with official events. A spike in revenue for a little-known consulting company days after a federal contract decision. The same name appearing in both contexts, her staff warned her. Don't lead with it. If you drop it too early, he'll dig in and deflect. So she didn't. She asked questions about budget allocations, about tariffs, about military deployments, sliding just close enough to personal matters to keep his lawyers on alert, but never so close that they'd raise a full defense. She was maneuvering step by step like a chess player who knows the king is trapped, but waits 3 more moves before announcing checkmate. And the thing about Trump, about any power player, is that they measure the room constantly. As long as the room feels safe, they relax. And when they relax, they talk, they answer, they commit to statements they believe are harmless, until someone circles back with evidence that makes those statements into traps. That's why, when Crockett finally shifted her tone, when she adjusted the microphone, and asked if any personal relationships had ever influenced his decisions, the air changed. It wasn't a loud change. It was the kind of shift you feel. The subtle tightening of a noose you didn't even realize was around your neck. The trap was now set, and all she had to do was close it. It started with a date. Nothing more. No accusation. No flourish. Just a date, spoken into the microphone with the weight of someone who already knew the answer. Not on May 17th of this year, Crockett began, her voice steady. Did you spend time at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Miami? It sounded harmless enough to the untrained ear. People stay in hotels all the time. Presidents travel constantly. But Trump's head turned ever so slightly, and his eyes narrowed, an instinctive reaction, the kind that surfaces before the brain decides what the mouth will say. I travel a lot, he replied slowly. I've been to Miami many times. I don't remember every single date. He treated it like a question to brush off, not a step in a chain that had already been forged. Crockett didn't push. Not yet. She simply nodded. That's fair, she said, flipping open a red-tabbed section of her binder. But perhaps this will help jog your memory. She described hotel security logs, showing a guest, registered under an assumed name, checking into a suite just 2 doors down from his, paid for in cash. Witness descriptions, matching a woman often seen entering private events hosted by him and members of his staff. The gallery went silent. Somewhere, a pen rolled off a table and clattered on the tile, but no one looked away from the exchange. Trump leaned forward, his voice sharpening. You're talking about a guest at a hotel. This is nonsense. But Crockett had already tightened the net. That's true, she said, evenly. Guests stay in hotels all the time, but according to witness statements, you spent over 3 hours in that suite that evening. The shuffle began, his legal team whispering urgently, passing notes between them. One finally spoke. Representative, we object to the insinuation. Crockett cut him off without raising her voice. I'm not insinuating. Stating what the evidence suggests, and the public will have the opportunity to interpret it. Then she asked the name. Or do you know a woman by the name of Veronica Hale? You could almost feel the heat shift in the room. Trump hesitated long enough for the silence to speak louder than any denial could. And in that pause, the hearing transformed from political theater into something far more dangerous, an evidence-backed confrontation with no escape hatch. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. The documents Crockett revealed weren't just about Trump's past. They hinted at a pattern. And buried in the fine print were references to meetings held at unlisted locations, involving individuals whose names never appear in public visitor logs, men with old money surnames, women whose family trees intertwine with the wealth of America's most powerful dynasties. These weren't political allies in the usual sense. They were the architects, the kind of people who don't campaign, they select who campaigns. One name in particular sent a ripple through the room. An heir to a multinational conglomerate that owns media outlets, defense contractors, and even pharmaceutical companies. His name was blacked out in parts of the report, but not carefully enough. Hera. And when you understand who he is, you realize something. This wasn't just about Trump. It was about the network behind him. The machine that can place anyone in power if it serves their purpose. Crockett's voice didn't waver as she laid it out. You think elections are a choice, she said quietly. They are a presentation. Every word hit like a hammer on glass. The audience, both in the room and across millions of screens, was being confronted with something far more dangerous than corruption. This was orchestration. The reaction from the other side of the aisle was instantaneous. Sodin. A senator's face went pale. A staffer hurried out of the chamber with a phone pressed to his ear. And while the cameras captured every twitch, every look exchanged, you could feel something else in the air. Fear. Not of political loss, but of exposure. Exposure. Because if these documents were accurate, and Crockett made sure they were, the story they told was not one of accidental alliances or chance meetings. It was the story of a deliberate grooming process. Presidents, senators, even federal judges, handpicked years in advance, cultivated like assets, and then sold to the public as leaders of free will. And maybe that's why Trump's legacy mattered so much to this group. How much to this group? Not because of his policies, not because of his public image, but because he was the perfect symbol of what they could do. A figurehead who could polarize the masses while the real deals were made behind closed doors. It wasn't just a scandal, it was the curtain lifting. You probably think political strategy is about policy debates, polling data, or campaign rallies, but here's the truth, they're theater props. The real battle is psychological. And in that moment, Crockett wasn't just answering Trump, she was reframing the battlefield. She stopped talking to him and started talking to the American subconscious. Her tone shifted, slow and deliberate, as if she were narrating a truth we'd all felt, but never said aloud. The cameras caught it. The slight arch of her eyebrow, the calculated pauses that stretched just long enough to make viewers lean forward. This wasn't just speaking. It was hypnosis in plain sight. Every line was anchored to a universal wound: corruption, arrogance, betrayal. And while Trump smirked, thinking he was holding ground, she was quietly stripping his armor in front of millions. It wasn't about facts alone. It was about framing him as small. That's the part no political consultant will admit. Once you make a giant seem small, the crowd stops fearing him. And in that silence, the audience's loyalty can shift without them even realizing it. That's what happened here. It wasn't just a verbal counter, it was a subconscious coup. And Trump, for all his bravado, didn't even realize the ground had already been pulled from under his feet until the applause hit. Not the kind that's loud, but the kind that's knowing. The kind that says, "We just saw something you can't undo." This is the game most people never see until it's already over. The room had shifted. What began as a political exchange was now something far more dangerous, an unraveling of a man's carefully constructed image. Trump's eyes no longer darted between Crockett and the cameras. They were fixed, unblinking, on her face. It was the look of a man trying to summon control in a space where control had already slipped from his hands. Jasmine Crockett knew exactly what that look meant. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lean forward, didn't break her rhythm. Her power wasn't in volume. It was in precision. She kept speaking, her words landing like deliberate strikes on the fragile scaffolding of his legacy. She wasn't there to debate. She was there to expose. She began to recount the timeline. Not in vague, sweeping accusations, but in a cold chronological order. Dates, locations, signed statements, bank transfers, and witness depositions. Each fact was a nail. Each pause was a hammer. The cameras caught every flicker of his expression, every tightening of the jaw, every moment his hands fidgeted before finding the safety of the table edge. The audience, both in the chamber and across the millions watching, felt the shift. This wasn't political theater anymore. This was something primal. She was peeling away not just the image of a man, but the myth that had sustained him for years. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath from viewers at home, sensing that this was the kind of moment that doesn't fade into the background. It carves itself into memory. Trump tried to interject, but his voice carried a strange mixture of bluster and hesitation. It was the sound of someone unsure whether to fight back or retreat. Crockett let him speak for 3 seconds, 3 seconds too many, before cutting in with a question so direct, so damning, that it hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Miss Trump, can you tell the American people why every single one of these records shows your name, your signature, and your authorization, yet you claim you have no knowledge of them? The silence afterward was a living thing. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if everyone knew they were witnessing not just a clash of personalities, but a fracture in history. And Crockett wasn't done. Not even close. The air inside the chamber was electric now, an invisible current running beneath every heartbeat, every breath. Crockett's words had stopped being just a rebuttal. They had transformed into an unrelenting prosecution. She wasn't simply defending herself anymore. She was putting Trump's legacy itself on trial, brick by brick, lie by lie. Every syllable was a hammer blow to the fragile facade his supporters clung to, and in that moment, you could see it, the flicker of doubt in faces that had sworn loyalty to him for years. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was the kind of doubt that creeps in quietly, erodes the foundation, and eventually makes the whole structure collapse. Trump leaned forward, his fingers interlaced in front of him as if trying to cage his own frustration. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted between Crockett, the cameras, and the aides frantically scribbling notes behind him. He was calculating, always calculating. Yet for the first time in years, it looked like he couldn't find the winning move. Crockett, sensing the shift, leaned just slightly closer to her microphone. Her voice lowered, forcing the room to lean in. She spoke of contracts hidden in shell corporations, of handshakes made under the table, of favors traded like currency. These weren't accusations pulled from thin air. These were dots she was connecting in real time, each link in the chain impossible to ignore. Some members of the committee shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the performance they signed up for. They expected political theater, snappy insults, a few social media moments, then back to the usual dance. But Crockett wasn't dancing. She was digging. And the deeper she dug, the more the room began to realize there might be no bottom to this pit. And then she paused, not because she lost her train of thought, but because she wanted the silence to work for her. The pause hung heavy. Camera zoomed in. Reporters froze their fingers above keyboards, waiting for the next line. Crockett looked directly into Trump's eyes and asked a question so specific, so laced with implication, that the very air seemed to thin. It wasn't just a question for him. It was for everyone watching. Question was this. The chamber had grown tense. But it wasn't just because of the confrontation. No, something deeper had begun to settle over the room, like the weight of a truth everyone could feel, but no one dared to name. Crockett leaned forward in her chair, lowering her voice, forcing everyone to lean in just to catch her words. She wasn't talking to Trump anymore. She was talking to the people. Not just those in the audience, not just the members of Congress, but to the millions watching at home. You've been told a story, she said slowly. A story carefully written to make you believe that power always wins, that wealth means truth bends in your direction, that the rules don't apply to certain people. She paused, scanning the faces in front of her. But here's the thing. When someone starts believing they're untouchable, that's when they're most vulnerable. And Mr. Trump has made that mistake. Trump tried to laugh, to wave her off, but the room wasn't with him anymore. You could see it in the eyes of the members behind him, those faint cracks of doubt, the subtle glances to one another. Crockett knew it too. She leaned back, opened the folder again, and pulled out something no one expected. A timeline. Not just dates, but moments, connections, patterns. This, she said, holding it up, is the thread you weren't supposed to follow. Every trip, every call, every deal. It all fits together, but only if you see it from the right angle. She slid the paper toward the committee clerk, who began distributing copies. If you think this is just a coincidence, then I suggest you ask why certain meetings took place in rooms without cameras, why certain flights weren't logged, and why certain witnesses are suddenly unavailable for testimony. Trump's smile tightened. His fingers tapped the desk, faster now. You could feel the shift. This wasn't just a political squabble anymore. Crockett wasn't just poking holes in his story. She was building a trap. Piece by piece, she was laying the foundation for something larger, something designed not to score headlines for a day, but to make sure the story stayed alive for months. And as the pages reached the reporters in the back of the room, you could already hear the rustle of notes, the clicking of keys, the whispers starting to build. Crockett didn't just drop information. She planted a seed, one that would grow in the shadows until it was too big to ignore. Because the thing about a house of cards is that it looks solid until the wrong person breathes in its direction. And Crockett had just inhaled, but Jasmine wasn't finished, not even close. After methodically laying out the timeline and exposing the contradictions in Trump's public statements, she pivoted to the question that no one in the chamber wanted to hear. Who else knew? The silence in the room was immediate, thick, and suffocating. You could almost hear the collective heartbeat of every aide, staffer, and political insider as her words sank in. This wasn't just about Trump anymore. This was about the network that had worked to shield him. The operatives, the donors, the media surrogates who had spent years twisting reality into a version the public was allowed to see. Jasmine's voice dropped, low and deliberate, almost forcing the audience to lean in as she recited names, not accusations, but reminders of people who were in the right room at the right time when decisions were made. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, out of. Others stared at her with cold, calculated defiance. She wasn't playing a short game. This was a slow disassembly of a power structure, brick by brick. As the cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, there was a flicker, barely perceptible, of something that wasn't anger, but realization. Decision. The kind of realization that only comes when you know someone just pulled a thread that, if followed, could unravel an entire tapestry. The chamber was still under official decorum, but in the back rows, journalists were already scribbling and texting, trying to connect dots faster than the story could even unfold. And then Jasmine did something that turned the moment from an exchange into a public reckoning. She held up a single document. It wasn't thick, it wasn't a binder, it wasn't even a folder. Just one sheet of paper. Her tone sharpened, each word slicing through the air like glass. This is the record they never wanted you to see. The ripple of unease was instant. For decades, political battles had been fought over narratives, interpretations, and spin. But a single piece of paper, especially one verified and authenticated, had the power to bypass the fog entirely. Trump's hand twitched, almost as if he was resisting the urge to reach out for it. Some say it was at that exact moment that the balance shifted, when the story was no longer about what could be proven later, but about what was happening right now, in front of millions, watching live. It wasn't just Trump's legacy on the line anymore. It was the entire architecture of silence that had kept certain truths buried. And Jasmine? She was just getting started. When the final gavel dropped, it wasn't just the end of a congressional hearing. It was the symbolic closing of a chapter in which power, arrogance, and manipulation had been laid bare under the hottest lights in America. Jasmine Crockett gathered her papers, not hurriedly, but with the deliberate grace of someone who knows she has not merely participated in history, but authored it. The cameras stayed locked on her, every lens desperate to catch the faintest shift in her expression, as if waiting for a private thought to slip through the armor. And in that quiet walk from her chair to the exit, 1,000 unspoken truths seemed to hover in the air. She didn't need to celebrate. She didn't need to gloat. The work was done, the facts were spoken, and the seeds had been planted in the minds of millions. But for the former president, those same moments were suffocating. The once commanding figure, who could bend a news cycle with a single insult, now found himself pinned in a corner, not by an opponent's anger, but by her calm dismantling of his narrative. His team scrambled for counter-messaging, crafting talking points before the echo could settle. But they knew the danger wasn't in what had been said. It was in what could not be unsaid. The facts were out there now, like a genie freed from a bottle, and every attempt to discredit them only gave them more oxygen. His allies whispered behind closed doors, wondering if this moment would be remembered as the first public crack in the armor, the instant where control began to slip. Outside the building, the air was charged. Protesters on both sides shouted across barricades, but something had shifted. Among the noise, there was a strange unity and curiosity. People who had never agreed on a single issue were suddenly asking the same questions. What if she's right? And more importantly, what comes next? This was no longer about winning a debate. It was about unraveling a deeper web of connections, timelines, and decisions that had been carefully hidden from public view. Jasmine didn't stop for interviews. She didn't need to. The truth had already taken root in the minds of those who watched, spreading faster than any soundbite. As she disappeared into a waiting car, the door closing with a final, muted thud, the real story had only just begun. Somewhere behind her, the most powerful man in the country sat in silence, realizing that for the first time in years, he was no longer dictating the narrative. He was trapped inside it. And in that shift of power, you could almost hear the sound of history changing course.